Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I am your host, Michael Manley, and the founder of Empowering Musicians. And I'm very happy to welcome John McMurtry to the podcast today. And John is the Associate Professor of Flute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, also a wonderful musician as well, and former flutist of the New York City Opera, and many other jobs. So welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy to have you because today's topic is not one I normally cover. Normally, we look at everything else that musicians need to have a healthy career that doesn't involve practice and doesn't involve their craft. But today, we're actually going to focus on craft and the act of preparing for auditions. And for those of you who are watching who may not be musicians or may not understand the process, for sort of classical performing arts professions like opera, ballet, and symphonic playing, we go through this very kind of like democratic and brutally democratic process called an audition. And what happens is people will submit their resumes and be invited to an audition. Lately, I think more and more people are being invited. I don't think we're hearing a lot of stories of people being rejected because there is a lot of attention to inclusion and diversity now in the field. So most people are being offered at least the opportunity to make a tape, if not a live audition. And within this process, there's no cumulative effect of your experience, right? So if John has played in the New York City Opera, which is a very prestigious opera company, or was until they sadly met their demise or near demise. They're still around, and they're coming back. But that experience will not matter, right? If you were to go audition for the Seattle Symphony, right, or the Chicago Symphony, because everything happens usually in the first few rounds, if not all the rounds, behind a screen. So the committee doesn't even know who's playing. Everybody's playing exactly the same pieces of music, which are little excerpts from the orchestral repertoire. And, the best person that shines that day gets advanced to the next round. So I think the only people that come close are actors, but even actors, I think, somebody can look at their previous work on stage or film, and they can get a sense of who they are. With this, it's really a democratic process. So if you're just coming out of school or if you had 20 years experience, you're both on the same playing field when it comes to the audition. So welcome, John. And why don't you give us a little bit of a sense of your history as a performer and a teacher?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so I grew up in the Northwest, and I did my undergrad in Central Washington. And I always knew that I had a burning passion to move to the East Coast and live a musical life there. And so after my bachelor's degree, I moved out to New Jersey, very close to New York City, and did my master's at Rutgers University. And then from there, I went on to get my doctorate at Juilliard. And during that time, I made a lot of contacts out there. I started freelancing in the area, in the New York City area. But I was always interested in academia as well. I always enjoyed researching and like commissioning composers. And when you live in a really large metropolitan area, just like New York City, you really get exposed to a lot of different kinds of artists and musicians and composers, and you form these sort of collaborative relationships with people. And I was always interested in playing in a symphony orchestra, and always knew that I was interested in the audition process, but I didn't actually start taking auditions until after I'd graduated with my DMA. And but this New York City Opera position came open. I think the previous person was there for maybe 42 years or something like that. It was a long time. And it was a Lincoln Center job, and I always just dreamed about performing there and having a regular orchestra job there. And so this job came open, and I decided to actually audition for it. Interestingly, at the time, I was actually living in Las Vegas, which is where I live now. And I had a 1-year job at that point at like UNLV. That was my first university teaching position. And I was really, busy with all of the things here, like Las Vegas, with teaching and just kind of moving and getting established. And And then this job came open, and I thought, well, I think I'd better take this audition. It's a chance to move back to New York. My former teacher, Bart Feller, was actually playing principal flute in the orchestra there, and so it would be a wonderful opportunity to be able to sit next to him and work as actual colleagues instead of in a sort of a teacher-student kind of a relationship. And so I worked very, very hard, and prepared for probably 2 months or so. And we can talk about some nuts and bolts of that. But long story short, I ended up winning the job, and so at the end of my year in Las Vegas, I ended up moving back to New York, where I had this job, and it was wonderful because we were when the time that I joined the orchestra, we were a 29-week symphony. So we were playing for 3 months, and then we were off for 3 months, and playing for 3 months, and off for 3 months. So it was perfect because the joke was always that we were never together long enough to be able to get sick of each other and of like the music. It was just always, and we were playing probably 7 shows a week, and all these different operas, probably 3 of them at a time in this kind of rotation. And so we were very, very busy for those 3 months. And then when we weren't doing that, all of us were teaching and playing freelance jobs and traveling and doing our own projects. And so it was a really wonderfully energized group of people, who would get together to be able to do this. And I've always loved performing in an opera pits. I've just always loved it for some reason. It's a different thing from playing symphony orchestra jobs because you're a lot less visible when you're down there, like in the pit, and your contribution isn't, because it's not as visible. It gives you a certain latitude, I think, to really experience the music in a very, very different way. And I've always loved opera. I was actually principal flute in an opera orchestra for 6 years before I joined the New York City Opera. And when I was preparing the list for the New York City Opera, I remember just really, the list was probably 30 excerpts long, and a bunch of first flute excerpts and second flute excerpts and piccolo excerpts. And some of the operas I hadn't played before, so I had to really do a lot of research on them and a lot of listening. And I remember sitting in the library at UNLV and listening to this one opera. I think it might have been I'm trying to remember which one it was, but this beautiful music, and I just thought, I started to tear up a little bit, and I just, gosh, I really love this music, and so I think just throwing my heart and soul into that preparation, knowing that I really loved that music, and I kind of had a sense of who I was going to be auditioning for. That really helped in terms of the process and getting through the rigorous 2 days of like auditioning that we did at that time. So I had that job for 4 years, and then it went bankrupt at that point. I got called to play. I got called to come out to Portland, Oregon, to play a year with the symphony there. And that was a wonderful experience as well. And at the same time, I was taking I was interviewing for college teaching jobs and university teaching positions. And I ended up going to Illinois, where I was for 7 years. And during my time there, I ended up winning a job as principal flute with the Peoria Symphony. And so that was my regular gig. And then after a while, and I was subbing with the Chicago Symphony on a regular basis, and the Detroit Symphony and various other places. And then the job came open out here, like in Vegas, and I thought, gosh, I just had such a wonderful experience out there. I have to give this a try, and fortune worked out, and now I'm here, and I've been here for 4 years, right before the pandemic happened.
That's wonderful, and it's great that you have that experience of playing with. You said the Chicago Symphony, the Detroit Symphony, and I think your resume said even the Met you've played extra with. And that's amazing that you had all that experience. So your passion now has been teaching. So you moved back here to teach. Are you still taking auditions, or are you, there's certain musicians I know I'm not one of them because I'm preparing for auditions now, is that like you get to a certain age and you're like, okay, I'm done with auditions. I'm just not going to audition. People know that I can play. If they want to hire me, they can hire me. I've not been of that mindset, but where are you in terms of taking new auditions if a job opened up that was interesting to you?
For me specifically, I'm not looking to necessarily move right now, but I do still like take auditions, especially for jobs that are more sort of part time and or where I can get like on the sub list. If a place I'd like to go and be on the sub list, I'll like take the audition just to become known. Um, and that's what I found in the past is that if I take an audition and I do well, even if I don't win the job, I somehow end up on the sub list, and I often get a call from that group maybe 6 months later or like a year later or something asking me to come and sub for them. And so I think it's important for me. It's important to keep taking auditions for I think a couple of reasons. One is because I want to have something to be able to give to my students. Yeah, I feel like I can best prepare them if I'm taking auditions myself. And if I'm part of that process and making peace with that process, then I have just much more to give as a teacher in terms of preparing them for that process. And two, I think it helps my playing in a certain way because it really forces me to um, come to terms with some things about like my playing that I need to work on. So I'm always trying to think about things like, oh, can I play this better in tune? Can my rhythm be cleaner here? Can I push the limits as far as the dynamics here and still get a good sound? You know, those are
Yep.
the things that I'm trying to think about. So my goal at this point is, yeah, I mean, I like love to win a job for sure, but my focus is more on the process rather than like the outcome. And I think the times when I've been most successful in terms of auditions has been when I've been really process oriented, and I just surrender at the outcome and just not worry about it because you never know like what's going to happen. You can have a bad day and still win a job. You can have your best day and not even make it out of the first round. And so it's really about your own personal process and how you're actually approaching those types of things. At least it has been for me.
Yeah, I think that is so key. And I agree with you 100% that like for me, the reason I take auditions, because it's like, well, why at this point in my career would I take auditions, right? Um, but for me, it's the best way to improve my playing, right? Not having a full-time playing job or teaching job. I love to play chamber music. That's my biggest passion. And preparing for a performance has the same effect, of course, but there's nothing that's going to really improve your playing more than preparing for an audition. And I think if you detach from the outcome, right, like you were talking about, if you go in thinking I'm going to win this audition, you can't control the outcome. You can only control your intention, and your intention is I want to showcase my best playing. And you're right. Sometimes you can do that and you can get nowhere, or sometimes I've made tapes where I got so mad because I paid somebody a lot of money to make a tape and I thought it was terrible. And I sent it in and it got accepted, right? And then there's other times when I've played really, really well and didn't get anywhere. And there's sometimes where I've played so badly that I took an audition shortly after that just to prove to myself that I wasn't that terrible. I was like, I have to prove that I'm better than that. And the next audition I got out of the first round, right? Like, which was for me a win. Like, it's like, okay, well, maybe I can actually do this, like on some level. But you're right. It really forces you to examine your playing in such a way. And if you have that kind of the model I like to use is the Carol Dweck growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So if you can remove your ego from it, if you can remove your ego as being this is necessary for me to affirm myself as a musician, and just go in saying I'm going to make music and grow from this process, you can really, I think, have a positive experience with the audition process as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece is just the removal of the ego from it. Because what I've realized over the years is that I'm really the worst judge of my own playing. And by that I mean that I've had really good nights on stage and I thought, oh man, I nailed that. It was just I did everything I wanted to do like musically with that. and nobody says a darn thing, you know. And then like other nights when I just think, oh man, I just barely survived that, and oh gosh, I don't know how I just got through that. I don't know what that even sounded like. And everybody comes up and it's like, oh my God, that was the most amazing thing I've ever heard, you know. So I've realized that, you know, you never know how you're playing on a particular day is actually going to land. And there's something, I think one of the things about music that's really magical is that it's about creating moments, and you never know when one of those moments is going to be created. Um, and so it could happen during the first round of like an audition. It could happen on stage at Carnegie Hall, or it could happen, you know, you're playing in a church for 40 people. I mean, you know, that musical magic is the goal is always to kind of create that magic, but we don't, as performers, we don't really have control over that. We don't, you know, sometimes the stars align and things happen, and our playing hits somebody in like a particular way that's particularly meaningful for them. And we don't really have any kind of control over that. All we can do is just um, is make peace with our own process. And fortunately, now we have so many resources for really preparing like for auditions. And you know, like Don Green has done some incredible work in that area. A lot of students and professionals use his work um, to be able to help them, you know, prepare for the process. For flute players, there was a book that was put out by Sharon Sparrow, who's the associate principal flute of the Detroit Symphony, who really just, it's called 6 Weeks to Finals. And she puts out this whole, you know, basically week 1, you do this, week 2, you do this, week 3, you do this, all the way up until an audition day. And just very, very helpful nuts and bolts advice about how to do it. And there are more and more resources like that now to kind of demystify the audition process. And I think it's a very healthy thing.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial. And I think for me, one of the challenges is that it's such an artificial environment, right? And you have to play pieces of music right next to each other that you would never play in performance. And then you have to somehow evoke the rest of the orchestra while just being alone on stage. And then you just have to like start a piece in the middle cold and not screw up the beginning, you know. So I'll spend a lot of time just starting pieces. But you know, one of the things you touched on, which I thought was really important, was, and I learned this. And you may have had similar experiences where you can't also, you have to be true to yourself as a musician. And I think this is something I've learned over the years. And you know, you can't necessarily, you know, try to please a committee or project what they're looking for. I think you just have to play like you're going to play, and you might be the right person or not. And I remember taking an audition for the New York Philharmonic years ago, and I took a lesson with one of the horn players, and he basically told me to take my hand almost all the way out of the bell and play everything much louder than I was playing it. And I didn't think it sounded great. I thought it was a little bit amusical, but I was like, well, look, he's going to be on the committee. He's in the orchestra. That's what I did. And then I thought I played a really, really strong audition, didn't get anywhere. And then another colleague who was in the orchestra, you know, said, oh, you probably played too loud. You know, 90% of people came in and just played way too loud. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's the last time I'm going to try to predict what to do. I'm just going to play the way I play and hope that it's going to be what they like, you know?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think a lot of us have those kinds of stories. For me, I have a similar one kind of from the opposite end. Because I had played with the Chicago Symphony quite a bit. And the, you know, the music director there is all about balance and you know, keeping things. And so, you know, being able to play incredibly softly, like for us, is a real skill. Softly in tune, like with a good sound. And so I made it to the finals for a job with the Chicago Symphony. And so I really had worked on that side of my playing, because I thought at that time that's what the group was really kind of wanting to be able to hear. And as it turns out, in the end, I wish I had maybe been a little bit more true to my own like dynamics, because I think I would have felt better about how I played in like the final round. I felt like I played well, but the mindset leading up to it was a little bit artificial in the sense that, oh gosh, this orchestra likes this, and I can show that by doing this, because we want to show that like we're flexible in a certain way, but in the context of a particular hall. You never know who's really going to be on the committee out there, because it's like behind a screen most of the time. So again, you never know how your playing is really going to land. And I think what you said about being true to being true to your own music and being true to your own preparation is really, really critical.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about that subject of like how you prepare, and then we'll get into a little bit about what your experience has been on committees, which is fascinating too. So when it comes, like, for me, I use this model. For me, I feel like there's two different kinds of musicians, very broadly, right? There's the kind that can just pick up their instrument and play and sound great on whatever they're doing all the time, right? Like they can wake up at 12 midnight and just play an excerpt and nail it. And there's people like me who I feel like I've never been introduced to my instrument like before when I start playing every day. It feels like I'm having to build from scratch in a way. And I don't know why that is. It's just, if I don't do my 20-minute workout in the morning, I just am not going to sound great. It's almost like a painter versus like sand painting. Like a painter can paint, and the next day the paint's on the canvas and they can improve. And I'm more like a monk that has like made a mandala out of sand, and the next day there's no sand. I start over from scratch. So what kind of musician would you say you are in that spectrum?
That's interesting, because I think when I was younger, I probably tended to be more like I was kind of building from scratch every day. And I went through a phase, especially during grad school, where because I think my own sound was the last aspect of my playing that really developed the way that I wanted it to. I was sort of a late bloomer in terms of sound. Like when I was younger, I could do, I won competitions because I could play higher, faster, louder. And then, and so when I went to study with Bart Feller, who later became my colleague, he heard me play at my master's audition and said, no, we're gonna turn you into an orchestra player. And so I thought, okay, this is great. This is the person I want to be working with. And so I went through this really frustrating period where it really felt like I was starting from scratch every day, just because I was building a whole new skill set. And I think it's important, that kind of mindset, instead of feeling like it's like, oh, I got to start from scratch every day, and just, it can be frustrating when it's over a long enough period of time. But just feeling like maybe, it's more of like a blank canvas. Maybe you're just learning something every day. Maybe you're teaching yourself something new, like every day, and trying to keep it in that kind of a context.
Mm, yeah. I think that's really good advice. And so when you're thinking about, and I have to tell you that, like, because of the way my career worked, I had dealt with injury and recovery many, many different times, and orthodontic work and other things. So I'm very much about adaptation and experimentation. And, I recently got a new mouthpiece, right? So for the first time in, I don't know how many years, I actually switched from the mouthpiece I've been using for 20 years to a new mouthpiece. And then realized that actually, like, my setting needed to be shifted slightly, and that I was getting a much better sound with the mouthpiece, a couple millimeters one way or the other. But these are profound changes, right? And so I'm trying to like embrace that and realize that, okay, yes, it's going to feel weird every day for a while, but we just have to embrace that new experience. So in terms of like practice strategies for an audition, like what are some of the things that you give yourself advice for when you're preparing? For me, it's like it doesn't matter how many times I've played Beethoven 7, let's say, I'm still working it out very, very slowly, or a Mozart horn concerto. I'm still having to do it from scratch, almost like building it, a couple metronome beats at a time, working on all of my articulations. So how do you approach that process of really trying to refine those standard pieces that you might have played for a long time? Do they just come naturally to you, or do you find you have to keep refining them?
I think for me, exactly what you said is pretty much what I do. Um, those do come naturally, but only because I've been playing for a long time. But but there's a downside to everything coming naturally too, because you can kind of you get to the point where, oh yeah, I can play this in my sleep, and it's a little bit like going back to play. So for us, the one of the big standard excerpts is Beethoven's Leonore Overture Number 3, and you get to the point in that fast solo where you can just pick it up and play it at 3 a.m. and it's not that hard. The problem is that when you think of it like that, after a period of time, the standard slips a little bit, and you find yourself compromising a little bit in terms of your rhythm, in terms of your pitch, in terms of your musical intention. So what I like to do before every audition is I get the list, and I try to pretend like I've never seen any of that music before ever, and that I'm actually learning it from scratch, and I'm doing the slow work. I'm not rushing myself. I think that's really important. One of my teachers, Jeannie Backstresser, who was principal of flute at the New York Philharmonic for a long time, she told me, she said, when you're taking auditions, you really have to keep your mind free of any kind of pressure. And so allowing yourself to be able to work at that process slowly, and not try to feel like you have to play things up to tempo too soon, I think is really, really important. And just to always focus on sounding sounding good, sounding like the way that you want to sound. And I find that if I do that, it maybe takes a little bit longer in terms of the front end. I don't get up to tempo as quickly as I normally would. Um, but the payoff is that you always have that musical vision in your mind about how it should sound, about how and hopefully you're listening to recordings, and see how other people have kind of approached these particular problems and how conductors do certain things. And it's also important to kind of embrace your own role in that particular excerpt. As you know, are there other instruments that are playing with you? Are you a solo? Are you playing with the strings? Are you playing with uh, you know uh, with like percussion? Like, what is the role there? So I think it's a combination of those things. Really knowing the music inside and out, not just your own part, I think is really critical. And that takes score study. It takes a lot of listening. I even play along with different recordings um, as part of my process. I'll do that, as I've gotten familiar with things, then I'll start to play along and feel what it feels like to, or at least try to simulate a little bit what it feels like to be in a particular section playing with people. And so, but the musical message always being first, I think, is what's helped me, because there's a tendency that, okay, I have to, I gotta, this is really hard excerpt, and I have to play it up to, quarter note equals 132 or something like that, and I just can't. And then so you try for this technical, you try to get it, better and better, like technically every day, but then somewhere along the line, the musical message tends to get missed if you're not careful. And so that's what I mean about getting the audition list and pretending like you've never heard any of those pieces before, and just, oh my gosh, I'm falling in love, like with Beethoven 7, like all over again. Oh my gosh, this is so neat. And trying to put yourself in that kind of like an excited mindset where you're just like itching to play like this music. And I think it's like falling in love with it all over again.
Yeah, I think that's really key, because it can become such, for me, especially playing things under tempo. And, you alluded to, for me, I mean, I might start something literally half tempo, right? Like if it's 132, you might start at 72, right? And work your way up maybe slowly over time. And it can become very mechanical if we're not careful. And that's my challenge, is like, okay, how do I realize that this is about music at the end of the day? And yes, I wanna be technically have everything working. But sometimes, especially playing things really slowly, we can forget the music and just
Yeah, it's so true. And I remember there was a period where I remember playing Firebird in like auditions, and I could always get through it, but I never felt comfortable playing it. It's one of the big flute excerpts, and it's very technical. There's a lot of leaps. The rhythm has got to be perfect. There's some like dynamic challenges in it, and it's kind of a hit or miss sort of excerpt. And I remember, getting through it and like auditions but I never felt comfortable playing it. And one time I just stepped back from it and I saw it on this upcoming audition list and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to start this from scratch. Like I'd never played it before. And so I was reading through it and I realized I was just paying attention to my own body and what was going on with the sensations. And I realized that in high pressure situations, I kind of been like going into this defensive crouch, like whenever I'd been playing it. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I discovered like one of the knuckles on my fingers was actually just like collapsing as I was playing it. And I thought, oh, that's really, I hadn't noticed that before. So I literally started at maybe a third of like the tempo and turned it into a sound exercise.
Mm.
And I just kept telling myself, be a bird, because it's like, because in terms of being able to do the actual gestures, you do have to be a lot more bird-like. And of course the flute, is always known as a bird-like instrument. So that's what we do. And so I remember, and just working it up just a tiny bit like at a time. And then, working it up 3 clicks and then going 2 clicks back. And
Mm.
then kind of working it that way, always going forward and then coming back and just reevaluating. And finally, over a period of time, I got to the point where I could play that excerpt, and I got rid of all that old muscle memory and kind of reform these new pathways to be able to make it into something new for me that I felt a lot more comfortable with. But now whenever I go back and play that, I actually have to start it all over again, because the muscle memory from when I played it from when I was 18, it's still always going to kind of be there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just always trying to create new ways of thinking about it to be able to overcome some of these challenges.
That's fascinating. And one of the things that I think I've learned a lot from in my career is that body awareness, right? And I'm doing that now with my own playing. And one of the things I've noticed is with some of these excerpts is that like my breathing has become a challenge. So I don't know if it's age or if it's because I had COVID, but like I'm having to really focus on like how to take relaxed air in and some really basic fundamental things like, how is my posture? How is my body alignment? And am I using my body efficiently, right? Like that's what you're talking about in some ways. And are there spots of tension? Your colleague there, Stephen Kaplan, is a wonderful expert on all of that stuff. And I'm overdue for a lesson with him on my just my own body use. So one thing I did want to touch on in our time here today was you sitting on a committee. What do you hear in auditions, whether it's for college students auditioning for UNLV, or I mean, I deal with high school kids that are maybe taking auditions for colleges. And my advice to them is always play it slower. You have to start playing slower. And you have to get your musical intention across at a slower tempo before you get it. And you have to have a musical intention. You can't just play notes, right? So from what you're hearing on either a professional orchestra level or a college professor level, when you hear auditions, what are you hearing that you want to tell students, and what is it that you're listening for?
Yeah, so I think there are a few fundamental things which I think are really critical. I think rhythm is a really good sense. I think that really applies to all levels. Just a good basic sense of rhythm
Mhm.
is when you're playing by yourself is really really critical. And you can tell, somebody who even somebody who hasn't been playing for that long, you can tell if they have a good sense of rhythm, if they really think about it.
Mhm.
Um, and usually, I mean, because our basic rhythm skills are something that we can all develop all the time, and it's something that we have to record ourselves often to be able to hear. I'm always surprised because I think I'm being perfectly rhythmical about something, and then I go to say record myself, and oh boy, I really compressed those 3/16 notes there. I should not do that. But if the student has a basic sense of rhythm, like produces a sort of a characteristic sound, um, those types of things, and has a fundamental awareness of a musical phrase, what a musical phrase is, and the style is just not just playing notes, but really aware that we're speaking.
Mhm.
We're trying to we're trying to really communicate something through like our music. Those things I think um, are sort of higher level skills that will make students very very successful. And I think the same thing really applies to our professional auditions. We want to hear a good rhythm, good pitch. Um, Sound isn't as important as everybody thinks it is, which is really interesting. Um,
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you
yeah, because people think, oh, I have to sound just like the principal player in order to win a job, like in the section or something, and that's not always the case.
Hmm.
You know, I think I think committees often, especially if there are people on an audition committee who don't play that particular instrument, they may not be aware that there are certain tendencies in, if you're playing like different kinds of horns, say in just like a section, they may not be aware of all the kind of intricacies of that, but they're going to be aware if the person is making music, and they're going to be aware of if the person can kind of play in tune, if they can play in a rhythm, if they're observing like dynamics on the page, and then beyond that, those things will all help you kind of get through a first round, and then beyond that, it's when you're advancing, and um, committees are trying to figure out who they want to work with for a long time. Uh, in like the final rounds, it becomes more about like the personality. It becomes more about, um, is this person really aware of style? Is this person, um, are they flexible? Can they be flexible? Can they? And then, because often in symphony orchestra, like auditions now, there's a chamber music part of it where either the principal, if you're auditioning for a section position, the principal player might come out and play with that person, or I've even seen it where for like a wind position, you might have to play with the orchestra's woodwind quintet, for like the final round. And so they're kind of gauging whether you can, how good of a colleague that you are, how good at like chamber music that you are, how you can like communicate through your music. Um, and so those things become a lot more critical, I think, at those later rounds. But it's very interesting because when I'm listening to colleagues play, especially like behind a screen, obviously I can't see them, um, and I'm sitting there really listening, like with the score, and thinking, I feel like I'm kind of playing the audition along with them in a certain sense,
Hmm.
um, and it's always very interesting because I can have my own ideas about what I want to hear, or what strikes me as being, really great, like playing. And my colleagues on the committee might have a totally different idea about style, or about what they want to hear from that candidate. So always realizing that the the results are kind of out of our hands,
Hmm.
and we're not going to be able to please everybody on a particular like committee, but it's like, if I'm taking a flute audition, how can I please the bass trombonist who's going to be on that like committee? Well, what are they going to be, And I think that style, I think there's certain things that are like universal among like musicians. We want to hear good pitch, we want to hear good rhythm, we want to hear good style. Those types of things are really critical, and so working on, I think that's one of the challenges of the process, is to be able to break all of those things down, and then to be able to put them back together into sort of a like cohesive package. And that takes a lot of time, and takes a lot of practice hours, both on your instrument, and then away from it as well, just through like listening and through visualization, um, and just being kind of immersed in that process.
Absolutely. I think what's fascinating to me about the committees, as you said, you could be on a committee for let's say it's a professional orchestra, right? And if you're in a flute section of a professional symphony, you're going to have three, maybe if you're in a big orchestra, maybe there's four flutes total, right? Um, so if you have an opening and you have two flute players on the committee, and you have five people that don't play the flute on the committee, they could have a completely different idea of a good sound on the flute than you have, or something else. And have you ever run into problems where people want to advance people that you're just like scratching your head over, or you want to advance people and the rest of the committee says, no, we don't dig that? Has that ever happened in your experience?
Yeah, that can happen most of the time. Most of the committees I've been on, we do it like by secret ballot. So we just vote for each candidate. They have to get a certain number of votes to be able to go on. So there isn't as much discussion until like the later rounds usually. But yeah, that can absolutely happen. And I think that the other thing that's really important to keep in mind, and I have to remind myself of this too, that you know I play the flute, and so flute players know what's really difficult, right? So
Mhm.
like Afternoon of a Fawn, we all know what the challenges are there with breathing and with the phrasing and the pitch and all that stuff. But a person who doesn't play the flute doesn't have a clue about why that like opening C sharp is so difficult. They have no idea. They have no idea why we can't just play that phrase in like one breath and just like call it a day, right? They don't know what's difficult. They just want to hear music. They just want to hear something happening that's like gonna touch them as ooh, this is somebody who's really special. Um, and it's the same for me when I hear just like oboe auditions or like horn auditions. I don't. I mean, I know it's hard in terms of because I hear people struggling with the same things often in just like auditions. So I say, oh, that must be really hard on that particular instrument. But I don't know what makes Till Eulenspiegel so difficult, like for the horn.
Yeah.
I have an idea, but I don't really know the technical specifics of it. So I'm just listening to see if they can make a phrase and play it in the Strauss style. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of important. It kind of frees us up a little bit in terms of our audition process too, just to make music and
Yeah.
just to try to convince a like committee through our like music making rather than through our technical prowess.
Yeah. I mean, I get that. And for horn, it's like, it's such a challenge. Like I mean, there's one I'm working on that's over 3 octaves. So you have to have the screaming high note, and then you have to be able to honk out a pedal note in tune, a bar later. And it's like, wow, why did this person write this? And now, but that's why it's on the list, right? It's that those challenges that make the music. But you're right. Nobody knows what's hard. But they know what good music is and what's not going to work. I think people can tell, and I've had colleagues say, well, look, in the first round, you just have to play the notes and you have to play them perfectly. You want to just get out of the first round. I've never subscribed to that view. I've always felt like I just want to show them who I am. And if they like it, they dig it or they don't. And that's why I think opera auditions are so different, because you really have to make music in an opera audition. I think, approaching these auditions, just being true to yourself, preparing as best you can, slower before fast, soft before loud, slower before tongue. That's usually my rules that I go by. Is the way to go. So, anything you want to leave our viewers with, if folks out there are preparing for, let's say, summer camp auditions, or maybe next year they're going to be preparing for college auditions, what advice would you give them in our last minutes here?
I think definitely if you're applying for school, definitely play for the teacher. If you're not already taking lessons with that particular teacher, um, seek out seek out a lesson with the teacher that you want to study with. Get to know them. Um, I think that's a really important thing. I think that musicians used to do that. I think that younger, students always used to do that. And I think that's starting to go by the wayside a little bit because people, the way people think about going to school now is very different from what it was. And so it's still very important to be able to reach out to your prospective teacher because they want to know you. They want to know like who you are. And I think it's and then students going like to grad school, playing for teachers, um, it's good to be able to have a couple of lessons with them kind of spaced out. So you do one maybe in the fall and then you try to get one with them in the spring, before you actually audition there. And I think that shows that you can take the ideas that you got from them and kind of integrate it into your own playing. So you might even play the same repertoire for them, and
Mhm.
then that way you're showing them that you can actually be a good student, that you can be adaptable, that you're willing to learn. um, you can't really teach the willingness to be able to learn, right? You have to, it's like that has to come like from the student. So and so all the things that like make you a good student, um, you can kind of you can kind of like position yourself to be able to make that known to whoever that you're auditioning for. And then I think the other thing is just to allow yourself to be inspired by like music just in general, and don't get so so specifically focused on your repertoire music? Because I think a lot of, some students who are really serious, they'll just, they'll focus on, oh, I listen to this person play this, and so I have to do it like this, and I have to do this. Well, musical inspiration can be found in a lot of different places, a lot of different forms, and so allowing yourself to be blown away by, like classical music, fine, but it could be jazz, it could be pop, it could be world music. I mean, there's so much amazing music out there, and just to really allow yourself to be taken in by it, I think is really critical as well.
That's absolutely true. And I think the audition for a college is so different in a way because you really have to work on that relationship. And, I auditioned, I ended up going to Florida State, which I loved, but I had a very interesting teacher, and I didn't know him very well, but I had a horn maker that lived a mile away from me in my little town of Maryland where I grew up. And he called me up one day and said, you should audition for this professor at Florida State. He's getting his horn worked on. So I went down the mountain and I auditioned, but I didn't know the teacher very well. And it turned out not to be maybe the best teacher for me at that stage of my career, although I learned an incredible amount about music from him. So I learned a ton about orchestral style and music and very little about how to play the French horn until I got to grad school. So you do have to have that relationship with a teacher and a student. And the most famous, possibly apocryphal story I know about this involves Tom Knifinger, who was a very just unbelievably beautiful flute player, taught at Yale. And the story was he had a grad student who came in and was, like about playing his or her tuning note. And he just said, you know what, I don't think this is going to work out. And so he fired them after one note. So, but that dynamic is so key. And if you're not studying with the right teacher, and the best teacher in the world may not be the right teacher for you, right? So I think that's really an important observation.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also it really depends where you are in your musical stage too, because the right teacher for you at the age of 14 is going to be different from the right teacher for you at the age of 18, which is different from the right teacher for you at the age of 25. So it's kind of evaluating where you are in that process, and then seeking out somebody who can really work with you on the things that you need to work on, and kind of allowing, sometimes that the truth hurts, right? And so you want to find a teacher who's going to really like tell you straight what it is that you need to what it is that you really need to focus on. And if you find that person that can really work with you on those things, then yeah, that's a recipe for a really long-term sort of working relationship right there.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, John, so much for sharing your afternoon with us here, your late morning rather, here in Las Vegas. And I look forward to making music with you again soon, and
Likewise.
seeing you around town. And how do folks connect with you if they want to learn more about applying to you on LV or connecting with you around your teaching or anything else? Are you on Instagram? Are you on Facebook? What's the best way to connect with you?
I'm on Facebook, and I have a website. JohnMcMurtry.com is my website. And you can always contact me through the UNLV page as well, through the faculty page there.
Perfect. And for those who are listening and not seeing our podcast, that's MCMURTERY, McMurtry.
Correct. Yes.
Well, thank you again, John. And I look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast this week to talk about all things auditions.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a true pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. Check out Empowering Musicians podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Audible. And please join our Facebook group, Empowering Musicians on Facebook. And we'll see you guys next week. Take care. Bye-bye.